Well, thank you so much for joining us here at the Voice of America. We talked exactly a year ago. You were just refused a visa to Uzbekistan, and then later on, in June, your office was closed in Tashkent. What has changed since then?
Well, thank you very much for having me. What has changed since then? Well, the human rights situation in Uzbekistan, each year Human Rights Watch publishes a report about human rights conditions in every country in the world, and we look at the past year, and we've recently published a report on 2011, and 2011 was a bad year for human rights in Uzbekistan. A lot of the same themes have continued. Torture remains a widespread problem in Uzbekistan. NGOs like ours have been shut down. Civil society remains under threat, and we see activists almost every day being detained and harassed. This didn't happen last year, it happened this year, but we just saw, just in the last month, 2 international journalists, correspondents being deported straight from the Tashkent airport, one from the BBC and one from Novaya Gazeta. So you have, unfortunately, the same human rights violations happening with the same intensity. In some ways, the situation is just as bad as it was, and in other ways, it's getting worse.
The Uzbek government never responds to any such criticism. At least we haven't noticed any response to your reports from Tashkent. And when you talk to the Uzbek officials, they usually claim that, well, these cases that international organizations are raising, they're not really very important ones or big ones or critical ones. They claim that there is a civil society in Uzbekistan, that there are local and national human rights societies, human rights network that defends freedom in Uzbekistan. What do you say to that?
Well, I think if there's nothing to hide in Uzbekistan's human rights record, then the government shouldn't be against opening up Uzbek society, allowing international independent observers to monitor the situation, to assess what progress has been made or not been made in the human rights conditions in Uzbekistan. This issue of the closing nature of Uzbekistan, the fact that it's become so closed, in itself is an issue of human rights, because there's a consistent theme. Wherever there's a problem, the current response of the Uzbek government seems to be to shut the door, to deny that there's a problem, to disengage, and to be very persistent in their refusal to allow independent monitoring and discussion about issues. So we see this across the board. We see on the issue of forced child labor in the cotton sector of Uzbekistan, which for many years now has been a serious concern of the international community. Our organization, along with numerous other organizations and even companies like Walmart that have signed the pledge not to use Uzbek cotton that is harvested by children, we have all been calling on the Uzbek government to simply allow the International Labor Organization into Uzbekistan to assess the cotton harvest during the fall, in September and October. And for 3 years, at least 3 years running, the Uzbek government has not allowed the International Labor Organization to come and perform its mission. So it's a very simple request. If there's nothing to hide, allow the ILO in to perform its mission. And in fact, those sorts of missions, the presence of international observers can be very helpful to working on problems cooperatively with the Uzbek government. It's the same situation with my organization. Our mission is to simply document and understand human rights issues that face different governments around the world, and then we take that information, we research it, and we make recommendations. And when we had an office in Uzbekistan, we were able to have more contact with the authorities and meet with them regularly, as well as with civil society. And then the other example of this, which is extremely important, is the UN. So 2012 marks 10 years now since a single expert, human rights expert of the United Nations, has been allowed into Uzbekistan with an official invitation to assess human rights issues. So you have the Special Rapporteur on torture, or the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion, or the Special Procedure on the independence of lawyers. All of these different institutions and experts, there are 10 of them, have been denied access to Uzbekistan. So unfortunately, you see a continuing theme of closure, of isolation, and I think it's in Tashkent's best interests to change that trend, to start engaging and opening up the space for local civil society and for international civil society more than it has.
So would it be accurate to say that the Uzbek government does not talk to you, is in no way contact with Human Rights Watch now?
In terms of contact with Human Rights Watch, we had hoped that, when I was there, I made my best effort to be in contact with all the relevant authorities, including the National Human Rights Center, which is run by Mr. Saidov, the Ombudsperson for Human Rights, that did actually meet with me, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Justice. I think we've tried to show over the past 15 years that we're incredibly interested and invested in Uzbekistan and will continue to be invested. And so we're ready to speak at any time, and we actually hope that we'll have that opportunity and be able to resume our work unhindered in Uzbekistan. I hope 2012 will bring some progress on that front. But since the Supreme Court decision of last year, there hasn't been any contact.
We know that you are in constant touch with the officials in the U.S. government who deal with Central Asia. You talk to the State Department, you talk to Pentagon. We also know that you're talking to Congress. What do they tell you? I know that you're asking for their help too to get back to Uzbekistan. Any progress on that?
What I'm here in Washington this week doing, and my colleagues as well, is presenting our new report on Uzbekistan, which you know about. It's called No One Left to Witness, and it focuses on the problem of torture, the issue of the habeas corpus reforms that have been a big subject of discussion around Uzbekistan, and also about the fate and the situation for lawyers in Uzbekistan. So what I've been doing is been talking to lots of members of Congress, the State Department, the Pentagon, about our findings, and unfortunately, the findings are not very positive. The findings are that torture remains a systematic problem in Uzbekistan. We've based our research on over 100 interviews. Some of those include sources in the Uzbek government, which verify, confirm that a variety of methods of torture are routine in Uzbek police stations and prisons across Uzbekistan. We found in the report cases of beatings with rubber truncheons, of 17-year-old boys who were accused of various crimes that have nothing to do with political activism. Routine allegations, accusations of, let's say, robbery or burglary. And in those cases, young men were brought into police stations and forced to sign confessions using physical pressure, psychological pressure. And we have a number of these cases. So we've been sharing these cases with U.S. authorities, with Congress, and trying to engage them in a discussion about human rights. We think that human rights issues in Uzbekistan have to be just as important. They are just as important, if not more, than the security interests, than all the other interests that are the responsibility of U.S. officials to promote. And what we're hearing is that there's a lot of frustration with the human rights situation in Uzbekistan. But I think there hasn't been a decision yet with where human rights come into this balance, how they can be best promoted. I think that's something that, at least our perception, is that the U.S. government wants to promote human rights as best as it can, but that it's really grappling with a situation that is very difficult, where it's unclear when pressure works and when sticks work and when carrots work. It's a very complicated calculus, and we understand, but we believe that it's in the long-term interests of the U.S. government, U.S. officials, and European governments and all governments to view human rights issues in Uzbekistan from a pragmatic point of view, put them in the center of their vision, and realize that a stable Uzbekistan, a stable partner for the United States, is one that respects human rights. And it's only through a more open society, one that respects more human rights, that you'll have that long-term stability and partnership with Uzbekistan.
Well, that's pretty much what we hear from the U.S. officials, though. I mean, they want long-term stability, and they want a prosperous Uzbekistan where human rights are respected. And they also tell us that they are trying to talk about human rights. Robert Blake, Assistant Secretary of State, always talks about the ABC's annual bilateral consultations, which Human Rights and Democracy Promotion is a part of. Have you been involved in those consultations? How much of a discussion is there on human rights, do you think, in those meetings? Because the U.S. government looks at them as a way to engage, to have a constant dialogue with these governments.
We fully support that view, and we realize and know and acknowledge that human rights issues are raised. But what I think where we differ is we believe that, especially in the last 3 years, and even more so with what happened in January, when a waiver was inserted in the sanctions that had been placed on Uzbekistan in terms of receiving military aid, we believe that there needs to be more public pressure. There need to be more public statements coming from Washington. There needs to be action taken. Sometimes there need to be consequences when you have egregious abuses continuing. What we hope this information about torture does is it serves as a wake-up call to officials around the globe, especially those in a position to change it, like Germany and the United States and Uzbekistan, and make more frequent statements, consider discussions of imposing consequences. So officials that engage in torture at the SNB, officials that engage in torture at Jaslik prison, they should not be able to travel freely. They should be sanctioned. There needs to be a combination of positive incentives, we believe, but also some meaningful consequences when governments repeatedly don't live up to their obligations. So if the ILO is not allowed to monitor the cotton harvest this coming year, we believe the U.S. government should seriously take that into consideration when it makes a decision about whether or not sanctions should be applied to Uzbekistan. So that's what we want to see. We want to see a combination of private diplomacy, private conversations behind closed doors with more public statements, and we also want to see some open discussion about, well, what consequences are going to follow if Uzbekistan continues down this path. If there are no consequences, then we think that the human rights situation will continue to get worse.
It's no secret that Afghanistan is one of the top foreign policy priorities for this government, and increasingly we see that that's where the focus is, and that explains why Washington seeks closer cooperation with Uzbekistan and its neighbors. Do you think that there is enough political will or interest here in Washington, since you've been talking to folks in Congress, to change that, to say, well, yeah, Afghanistan is really, really important, but we shouldn't forget these issues too?
That's part of the reason we do what we do. This is why Human Rights Watch tries to inform the world community about issues. We believe that with knowledge comes empowerment. And, one of the costs of the war in Afghanistan that we think the American public and again, the world at large is not really taking into account is the damage to Western values in promoting or subsidizing or quietly, let's say, supporting what President Karimov's government is doing while trying to build democracy and human rights in Afghanistan. There has to be a balance. So, of course, the NATO is an alliance that was formed to promote democracy. It's not just a military alliance. It's an alliance that is about promoting democracy. So, isn't it a problem if part of the equation means supporting abusive practices that are going on in Uzbekistan? That calculus has to change, and we also believe that the U.S. and Germany and the EU and NATO, they have a lot of leverage, of course, through their military relationship with Uzbekistan to influence the situation. There's a lot of profit that the Uzbek government makes off of this relationship. Every time there's transit of goods or supplies through Uzbekistan, there are tariffs, and those tariffs yield monies which are going directly into the coffers of the Uzbek government. And so that should be seen as an asset to raise human rights issues.
That should be used as a leverage, you mean?
We believe it should.
How about a more pragmatic approach where some people might say, Islam Karimov has been in power in Uzbekistan for more than 20 years. And with him remaining in power, probably it'll be a little too naive to expect any major changes. The kinds of miracles they say that groups like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International are expecting are really probably not happening as long as he's in power. And maybe some people in the U.S. government also think that way, that, well, let's work on this because we can work on it. And let's work on those issues when the right time comes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think our response to that would be that the change is possible. Sometimes it's smaller, sometimes it's larger, even with a partner as sometimes unpredictable, let's say, as Uzbekistan. There have been moments when senators have written letters to free a political prisoner, and we've seen them later released. There have been times when issues have been raised, and there have been small successes over the years. And we'd like to see that multiplied. That sort of effort to intervene on issues should be sustained, and it should be done with more intensity now.
But Steve, that has become a pattern, when U.S. government pushes and Uzbekistan releases a prisoner or two here and there, and the West interprets as a success or as progress. But on the ground, things haven't really changed much. You know that. And some of your critics here in Washington, you do have critics in Washington too, not just in Uzbekistan or other Central Asian capitals, they say that your critical reports are not really constructive, that you are not being realistic enough, you're not looking at the real picture. And some of them even claim that you're not looking ahead. They think that U.S. government is actually doing the right thing by working more with the Uzbek government, even though it doesn't have to do much with human rights, but they're also, working on creating some leverage here. That more engagement is actually good because that creates a way or opportunity to discuss then other issues too.
Again, we support engagement. We want to see more principled engagement. So we absolutely don't advocate isolationism or cutting off ties or simply punishing Uzbekistan. That it's absolutely not neither our philosophy or our methodology. In terms of being constructive, our job is to report accurately and objectively the information we collect and really look at how international law is being applied or observed. And so, on the issues that we're researching, torture, the state of the legal profession in Uzbekistan, unfortunately, there isn't much positive that we can say because the facts on the ground show that torture is just as bad, if not worse, as it was when the special rapporteur said it was systematically happening 10 years ago. And what we have now, of course, is 10 years of no visits by the UN. So until the Uzbek government credibly can rebut those assertions, there's simply no evidence that there has been improvement. So I don't think it's a matter of us being constructive or being overly punitive. I think it's about the facts and the truth and being willing to face up to the evidence, and it's evidence that simply can't be ignored. In terms of the longer view of things, again, we believe that the Uzbek people have to be hearing more loudly and clearly when U.S. officials are visiting or European officials are visiting Tashkent. They should be hearing in the press, if they can, open statements of concern about the human rights situation. It's better if those things can be said out loud than only in a room with President Karimov.
I remember when Secretary Hillary Clinton went to Tashkent last time, October of 2011, she focused a lot on human rights. She even talked about the human rights and democracy at the GM plant.
The reference to human rights did come at the end of a speech at the GM plant. And wouldn't it have been, for example, so powerful if there could have been an open event like there was in neighboring Tajikistan, where there were dozens of people attending, discussing issues with civil society. We understand that's really hard to do in Uzbekistan, and it's irritating to the Uzbek government. But it's something that should be hopefully part of the next agenda, the next visit. We're for principled engagement, one that combines private diplomacy with a willingness to speak out and criticize abuses when they happen. Not it's the job of diplomats to determine when they'll intervene and when not. But when you see over the past 3 years, a sort of quieting down of the criticism, I think that's what's concerning to human rights groups, not just Human Rights Watch. And I thought of I was going to say in response to one of your earlier questions, that when U.S. sanctions applied to Uzbekistan, and when EU sanctions applied to Uzbekistan, it's simply a fact that there were more civil society organizations operating, such as Human Rights Watch. There were more human rights defenders were being released between the years of 2006 and 2008, some of the most tense years between the West and Uzbekistan. And since the lifting of those sanctions, there have been much fewer releases. There have been maybe 6 people released since October 2009 when the EU lifted its sanctions. And what that says to us is that pressure does sometimes work. It's the only thing that stands in between civil society being attacked and allowed to exist. But when that pressure is taken away and when there are no consequences, it's much easier to crack down on civil society. It's much easier to say, we're not going to allow the ILO in, we're not going to allow human rights observers in, because there's no price to be paid. So what we're simply asking for is a combination of those tools and a willingness to speak out critically when it's called for.
Thank you so much.